Welcome, my name is Mark Treadwell and this is an introductory video to a resource called Learning, How the Brain Learns, and you can download the resource, the full text of that resource from marktreadwell.com free of charge, and you can then use that for professional learning inside your school or institution and or for your professional interest. So in this first video, what I'd like to do is give an overview of how we now think the brain learns and the implications of that for teaching and learning. So this is a quick overview, then there'll be a series of other video clips that look at some of this in more detail, as well as the text, of course, for the greatest amount of detail. So this whole project started with a question, and the question that I had at the time was this: why is it that driving, which is an incredibly complex task and possibly the most complex cognitive task we ever attempt, why is driving learnt so equitably? In other words, a rocket scientist doesn't learn to drive a car any quicker or any safer than you and me or anybody else. Why is it that learning to drive is so equitable as a learning task, given that it is so demanding from a learning perspective? So learning to drive will take you somewhere between 60 to 100 hours possibly to learn to drive, and after a couple of attempts at a practical driving test at the end, you will be given your driving license. And it doesn't matter what your IQ is. So the insurance company, when you go to sort of insure your car, doesn't say, look, you know, smarter people obviously would drive much better than non-smart people, let us know your IQ so we can adjust your premium accordingly. That doesn't happen. So if we compare driving, very equitable, very complex, very equitable, and we learn it very quickly, to reading and writing, which is nowhere near as equitable in terms of success, and also it takes us so much longer. Even if you're told at school that you were quite smart, it took you a long time. Generally speaking, somewhere between 5,000 to 7,000 hours to learn to read and write. Whereas driving took somewhere between, around about 100 hours. A tiny fraction of the time it took you to learn to read and write. So my question was, why is it that learning to drive is equitable and we do it really, really quickly, regardless of how complex it is, whereas reading and writing takes much, much longer and also is nowhere near as equitable? Why is that? So we started this journey, and so initially we started to look at research around the structure of the brain and how the brain worked, etc. And as we were working through this, it was obvious there were two very distinct groups of neuroscientists who thought very differently. And this was 10 years ago when we started this. Then most people had a neuron-centric view of the brain. In other words, the neurons did everything that was important in terms of thinking and learning and intelligence, etc. Whereas the rest of the cells, they were just there to look after the neurons and make sure they got what they needed. Now the interesting thing around that model was that when we're first born, our brain is mostly neurons. Okay, so it's mostly neurons. By the time we're in our mid to late 20s, it's mostly another type of cell called astrocytes. So human beings, as adults, we have about 7% neurons, and about 76% of our cells in our brain are called astrocytes. So what do these astrocytes do, and how do they relate to neurons when it comes to learning? So that was our first obvious sort of difficulty. And neuroscientists were quite at odds with each other around the importance of astrocytes. In the last few years, we've started to realise that astrocytes probably are the dominant cell when it comes to higher order thinking and learning. And so we're introducing now another cell type, because most of us would have gone through university and our teacher training or our experiences in life, and we will know about neurons. We may not know much about them as such, but we know that neurons are important for learning. But here we have a new cell type called astrocytes that we're introducing into this model. And we're predicting that these astrocytes have a huge role when it comes to higher order thinking. So, in this resource that we've produced, we're going to be looking at, first of all, how the brain learns, because we need to get a headspace around that. And then we're going to start looking at the learning process. In other words, what's the optimal process for learning? How do we actually teach anyone at any age to learn most effectively? How can we learn everything as quickly as we learn driving? How can we do that? Is it possible even? Then we're going to be looking at the competencies. And the competencies are the capacities people need to become lifelong learners. Most curricula around the world for schools and universities, etc., have as an output that we want young people to be able to learn for life, be lifelong learners. And the reason for that is our whole workplace and social place has changed dramatically. We are learning at an unprecedented rate at the moment. Whether it's to use devices, whether it's to choose a power company that we need to have, where should we go for a holiday. There are so many choices we now have that life is no longer prescribed for us. We're prescribing our own lives. We're describing our lives not just in the workplace, but in our play space, our social place, our travel place, wherever that might be. We're now making huge numbers of decisions at an unprecedented rate. Just 30 or 40 years ago, 80% of people went to work to be told what to do. They got told exactly what to do every day. And this applied for teaching and learning as much as anything else. This is not just something unique to sort of the production line facilities that we had, that are largely now gone and been replaced by robots. Now we need to actually make sure that young people leave our schools ready for the society they're going to go into. And that's a society that is changing at an unprecedented rate. So those competencies are the ability to think and question, the ability to connect and reflect on the ideas and the capacities they have in their minds to come up with new ideas. Everyone now wants people who are innovative, creative and ingenious. So what do those words actually mean? They need to be able to connect and reflect in order to do those things. We're expecting people to be able to manage themselves. It's not managing just their resources, but also their virtual world, their emotions. A whole range of capacities are tied up in managing self. The students need a literacy. Anyone that wants to learn needs to have a literacy around learning as well. So there's a literacy there right across not just reading and writing, but across video, multimedia, a whole raft of new media types and forms that we haven't had to deal with largely in the past. The next thing we must have a capacity around is our own identity. Having a sense of self, understanding self, being able to be metacognitive and reflect on our own learning processes and how we can improve those. And lastly, we've got the sixth competency is the ability to collaborate. Collaboration in the past was called cheating, and now we say, well, no, cheating is a good thing. We need to learn as efficiently and effectively, and that requires us to collaborate with others, working alongside each other. What does that take? What sort of capacities do people require in order to be effective collaborators? So the competencies are there, and then we need to look at also at some trending ideas around technology. Now, I'm cautious here a little bit because technology is iterating quite quickly at the moment. But we are going to deal also with the role of technology in our learning, because almost everybody now has a device, and I mean almost everybody globally now has a device of some form where they're accessing information, and increasingly the information is being accessed in a video format rather than a text format. So what does that say about the importance of reading and writing as we progress? What's the importance alongside that of being able to interpret video? It's all really well watching a video, but can we interpret that? What technical processes are required in order to do that and do that well? So in this resource, we've developed a model, and that model really looks at, rather than human beings having one learning system, we think that actually all species have a number of learning systems. Most have the first one only, and that's our first learning system, is our ability to sense our outside world using our senses. Okay, so human beings have 23 senses, other species have more or less, but really when it comes to senses, our ability to interpret our outside world, because our brain needs to see beyond our skull and actually sense what's out there using our senses. So how does it do that? Okay. Firstly. And secondly, our sensory systems really are very equitable amongst the population. We don't talk about an IQ in terms of senses. Everybody can do that reasonably well unless they have some difficulty with reading, with seeing or hearing, etc., because of some physiological deficiency somewhere. Okay. So our senses, our first learning system. Our second learning system is to learn off by heart, or to sequence things. So we might have sequences of letters to make up a word, we might remember the letter O and its sound and its shape and be able to draw that, etc. So learning via rote is not very equitable. It's the least equitable of all our learning systems. In other words, some people have an advantage in that space to be able to learn and remember off by heart or by rote. Our third learning system is our ability to create new ideas and new concepts. So when we learn by rote, we build our knowledge. So our knowledge is the fundamental sort of stuff we have to build from. But also, before that again, we've got our sensory systems that allow us to do that sensory stuff, they allow us to read and write and see the world around us and build a picture around that. And our third learning system is the capacity to form ideas and concepts from the knowledge and from our sensory information coming into our heads. So ideas and concepts, they are equitable for everybody. Everybody has the same capacity, roughly speaking, when it comes to ideas and concepts. So that's equitable, but we are the only species that can form new ideas and new concepts on the fly. No other species can do this. It's simply not possible for them to do that. They can do that biologically and genetically very slowly over many, many generations. They can adapt, but human beings can make a decision in the next 10 seconds to adapt to a new situation they find themselves in. We're the only species that can do that. And our fourth learning system is our ability to be creative. And that once again is a solely human capacity. So human beings have all four learning systems. Okay, so we have all four. All other animals either have one, the sensory system, or maybe sensory system and some limited ability to learn via rote. So dolphins, monkeys, some birds can actually learn by rote as well. Right? But only we can form new ideas and concepts on the fly, and only we can actually be creative in an instant. So we have all four species, all four learning systems. So what this resource is looking at is what are the implications of that model of having four learning systems. How can we optimize those four learning systems so that everybody can learn as equitably as possible? Because at the moment that's not the case. Some people leave our schooling systems thinking they're just not smart at all. They just cannot come up with new ideas. They cannot be creative. And that simply is not true. Okay? So what we want to do is rethink the very substrate that makes up our teaching and learning pedagogical practice that we use on a day-to-day basis. How can we do that differently? Okay. So we as human beings, and Marion Diamond did some fantastic research around this, we have the lowest ratio of neurons of any species and the highest ratio of astrocytes. What does that mean for learning in our classrooms? So this is the first introductory resource, give you a bit of an overview, and there's a number of other video clips through the resource that will follow up on particular aspects of what we've just been discussing. So enjoy the resource, I hope you found it interesting, and hopefully you'll see the implications for your teaching and learning practice in your classrooms. So thank you very much and enjoy the resource. Thank you.